Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review two movies. Equilibrium, which ultimately stars Christian Bale, and we are also here to review the movie Passengers, which I have seen both of these films fairly recently, and at the end of the day, I just wanted to say what I felt about both of them, what I felt, my concerns, my otherwise justifiably reason for why I watched a whole portion of these films. So, going into both of these, you could probably say that, oh, well, what is the convenient way of which that I can see this movie or movies? Technically, there isn't exactly one. If anyways, you can probably go out of your way to probably rent any number of these on a Amazon. I would probably suggest everyone to go on a app that I believe still exists called Movie Pro, because I went on there today to see both of these, well, one of the films. I had seen Equilibrium days ago because ultimately I just wanted to kind of relax and just not have to just flam out a crap ton of reviews. I just wanted to take one day off and just chillax for once. So, going into these movies, though, let's first talk about the Equilibrium. So, this Christian Bale movie, I ultimately like the action that is in it. I ultimately like the way that they kind of approach every quasi-fight scene, because it seems like everything is slightly a little bit different when you approach these kind of fight scenes in this movie. A lot of times it's kind of like flipping guns around. When somebody's holding a gun, you have Christian Bale that it's like flipping the gun back on the person to where he's going to shoot them. I really like how most of the fight scenes are shot, because you ultimately have like a person that is firing in all kinds of weird, bizarre, like angles. Like seemingly 360 villains are all around him, and he is firing away like crazy. Like visually, there is some amazing things going on in here, and plus, this movie ultimately feels like a very futuristic like approach, which ultimately I can enjoy, and I couldn't avoid but watch this again because I've seen it once before, but I didn't remember seeing the entire movie. So I just wanted to finally really go into this and finally say that I went out of my way to saw Equilibrium. We ultimately have Christian Bale in this movie, who of course a lot of people would know as the Batman. The Batman. The Batman Begins, Batman, The Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan, Batman, as well as being in Reigns of Fire and all kinds of other things. Also, probably in some Jungle Book movie as some voiceover character that I don't remember. Anyways, we also have Tay Diggs in this movie, and I was excited about seeing Tay Diggs because how rarely do you ever get to see this man in a film. Also, we had Dominic Purcell, which ultimately I had recently seen in Straw Dogs. Also, I think he was in the show John Doe, so that's great. We also had Shane Pertwee, ultimately the guy that ultimately at some point had played Alfred in the Gotham show, so that's great. Other than that, yeah, let's ultimately break down for people that have never heard of this movie before what it's about. So, reasonably, this movie kind of breaks down to me as, like, it kind of breaks down as a movie where people are trying to purge all emotions, is the real cue of this movie. So, reasonably, we live in a future where people do not have feelings, do not feel. And so, reasonably, they don't have, like, the feelings of love or romance or any other kind of things along those ways. Really, you have people that have to take this, like, medication into their neck to keep them from feeling emotions and or such. And they have to do it daily. So, we live in a kind of like we happy few kind of thing, a kind of like if you've ever played that video game where they have to take like their happy pills. This kind of feels like the same thing to me, with the exception of these people not feeling anything at all, and they're just being like cold-hearted criminals. Reasonably, eventually, we have to where Christian Bale ultimately just tends to slip one day and not take his medication. But then more and more, he just starts to slip even more, going further and further along. Really, ultimately, to see how far down the rabbit hole Christian Bale's character, John, will go. I think most of the time he's called Cleric in this movie. But yeah, we have it to where Christian Bale's character is slowly but surely realizing that maybe what they are doing is not the right thing to do, because basically when they are talking, like, they're basically showcasing that everybody needs to be or have sameness, has to be like unity or uniformity. And so reasonably, with the loss of emotions, everybody does not rationally care what their desks look like, or what their like what they're wearing, or what they're going into, or anything like that. And you have this person who is a police officer of sorts, and so reasonably and or rationally, you have seemingly evidence having to be filed. There's sometimes where it seems that not every evidence can be easily found by everyone, and so people supposedly make mistakes. But then also we realize that there is some underlying thing about that. So I thought that this movie was, it has to be kind of this kind of like steady kind of thing. But I like the action points. I think the action kind of makes up for everything else. I thought it was an okay film. I thought it was reasonably an interesting rewatch to enjoy. So let's go into talking about Equilibrium in a much more unspoiler-like talk. Then ultimately, if you guys want to say that you want to go out of your way to fast forward to the point of The Passengers to hear what I have to say about that, pretty much all you have to do is just fast forward to the point to where I shift to this screen here, and ultimately you'll see the review of Passengers. I'll talk about it. I'll go into it. But otherwise, let's go into this spoiler variation of Equilibrium. Let's bust out that double five, that delicious otherwise count to ultimately say, after this amount of time, we're going to spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, I don't know what I'm doing. Equilibrium. So the spoilers of this movie is pretty simple. Reasonably, it's people who become emotionless that eventually will get to a point of to regain their emotions by stopping them putting their in their necks, their drug of choice that blocks their emotion, into their necks. They stop taking them, simply enough. So, in the very beginning of this film, we have Christian and or Bale, John and or Preston, cleric. We have Christian Bale that ultimately is going off and doing a raid, finding some seemingly people that are people who are no longer taking their medication, their drugs, and they're trying to feel. So we have it to where Christian Bale needs to kill all these people, and ipso facto, he breaks in and decks some people, kills a lot of people, and ultimately he finds out that there is a hideout of paintings. And so recently, they have to burn all the paintings so that way nobody can feel anything from any of these paintings. And one of those paintings was like the Mona Lisa, and I was like, oh my god, Mona Lisa, Christian Bale, what are you going to say about that? And he's like, burn it all. So we have burnings of expensive paintings, but I guess it's just, there's no value in them anymore. So recently we have it to where both Christian Bale and Sean Bean, who ultimately a lot of people might know as another 007 or 006 from one of those Bond films. Also, you might know him from Lord of the Rings, or maybe even, I don't know, maybe a Game of Thrones. Maybe you might be familiar with him in that movie or that show, where ultimately he's the guy that otherwise is in the pilot episode chopping off some dude's head and saying, hey, yeah, winter's coming, mother. So, Sean Bean ultimately playing Partridge in this show, in this movie. We have to where it seems that Partridge and John are both partners. Christian Bale and Sean Bean's character are partners. So we have to where Sean Bean ultimately showing Christian Bale that, hey, yeah, I got some evidence of this book. I'm going to go and file this evidence. And because ultimately sometimes they misplace some things. Evidently sometimes they F up some stuff. So I'm going to go and I'm going to file this book into evidence. So Christian Bale is talking about, talking to his partner, just kind of hearing some things out. And some of the things of which that his partner says just doesn't quite sit easy with him, to the point where he has to replay that conversation back. And like, he's ultimately already starting to question whether his partner is having feelings or not. So we ultimately have Christian Bale that has to go into the evidence and see if his partner had filed the evidence, and the partner did not file the evidence. So Christian Bale has to drive out there to see where his partner has been hanging out, and we ultimately find that his partner is reading this book and enjoying it, because why not? We ultimately have it to where his partner is feeling, Christian Bale's partner is feeling. And so reasonably, we have it to where Sean Bean eventually puts the book further and further in front of his face, and he starts grabbing for his gun. Like, Christian Bale says, I'm sorry, and Sean Bean is like, I bet you don't even know what that means. Like, I bet you can't even feel sorry. I bet you can't even feel guilt. Like, you like, you don't realize what this is doing, really. It's like, you're just a heartless person that doesn't even mean what you say. Like, that is the worst thing about you, is just the mimicry that you're trying to put off as a person, but you're not even doing it that well. So Sean Bean is grabbing for his gun while having his book to his head, and Christian Bale has to blow the trigger and kill his own partner. We ultimately have Tay Diggs coming in, as Brand with a T at the end. Probably the T is silent. So we have Tay Diggs coming in here, and ultimately he is mentioning that, hey, I'm going to be your new partner, like, right away. Like, it's like, good God, already blowing the whistle on this partner is going to immediately get you a new partner, I guess, in this time. So we have Tay Diggs that is basically driving Christian Bale back to his home, ultimately telling him, it's like, yeah, like, I'm so excited about being a partner of yours. It's like, if anything, like, I think me being with you is gonna make my career, and dot 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 dot. And Tay Diggs is just like, yeah, like, I think you and me are kind of like the same. If anything, like, you can, like, sense people and, like, sense them before they can even think that you can sense them, and I feel like I can do the same thing. So we have two sensing people sensing that Christian Bale is going to leave, ultimately telling his partner, we'll have a good night, and goes home. So we have to where Christian Bale's character ultimately drops his medication that he's supposed to take, and ultimately we have it to where his son comes in, walks in on him, dropping his medication, and he's like, well, uh, I guess you're gonna have to go and tell the guys you're gonna need another dose, because his son ultimately is asking his father. It's like, well, hey, I saw one of my friends cry, Daddy. Should I report him? And Christian Bale's like, unquestionably, yeah, get him. Call him in. He's crying. No kid cries. They're unemotional. Unemotional. So we have it to where the kid maybe quite possibly uh, calls his friend and out and being crybaby. I don't know. Doesn't show that scene in the movie. Pushing on. So we have it to where Christian Bale wakes up or gets up in the morning, and evidently his partner had called the home, and we had his son answer the phone. And so the son ultimately tells Christian Bale, Daddy, I told your partner that you were going to go and get another dose. So you probably will be late. And he's like, are you sure that is it okay that I told him that? And Christian Bale's like, yeah, it's perfect. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. Unquestionably fine. Yes. Greatest thing that you've ever said in your life to tell that friend of mine, that partner of mine, that I'm going to go and get some drugs because I need them. So ultimately, we have to where Christian Bale is going to the place where he needs to go and get his drugs, and he is just standing out in front of it for a very long time. To the point where Tay Diggs ultimately comes driving by and he's like, wow, hey, yeah, like you must be done getting your dose. Oh, good for you. Like, I'm going to come in here and pick you up. And of course, Christian Bale never went for the dose. So we have to where Tay Diggs is like, yeah, I think I might up my dose a little bit because I don't know, I'm just kind of feeling a little emotional. So I guess I should probably just up my dose a little bit. So pushing on. So eventually it gets to where they have to crack down on more of these emotional people. It seems that we have DuPont, who is consistently like in a lot of those detectives movies, you have that superior that always has to give everybody crap. Like basically, he's pushing them to be way better at their jobs than they should be, or whatever, or he's just mad that there's still emotional people on the streets, and he's just like why aren't you working harder? And all of this, and also kind of questioning stuff about like Christian Bale's past at some point, kind of bringing up stuff about his wife ending up getting killed because she was an emotional woman. She was an emotional person, and ultimately we find out that Christian Bale didn't kill her. It was someone else, and ultimately someone else took her in. Uh, I thought that was interesting. So we have to where Christian Bale doesn't his partner, but he never arrested his own wife, because ultimately we have it to be shown in a dream of sorts that Christian Bale was asked by his partner, hey, do you dream? And he was like, no. But evidently once Christian Bale starts feeling again, he has a dream to remind us what had happened to his wife, where his wife was ultimately feeling, and all of a sudden Christian Bale is awakened by his wife being taken. So ultimately, like, we have Christian Bale who flings the gun at the guy, and the police officer's like, "No, no, don't shoot." It's like, if anything, this arrest is justified. It's like, she's feeling. She's a feeler. She's a 16-wheeler feeler. Come on. We got to take her in, Christian Bale. Batman. He's like, okay, all right, sure. Go ahead and take my wife that I have 2 children with. Go ahead, because she feels. So, ultimately, we have Christian Bale's wife telling Christian Bale, remember me forever. I will haunt your dreams whenever you do actually dream, which will probably be a long time from now. So, we have to where ultimately they go on into reasonably. We have to where Christian Bale is repetitiously trying to go throughout his police day, but it seems like more and more he is starting to quasi lose control. Quasi not being the stone-faced person he is known to be. And so people are getting little sniffs here and there of that, but ultimately Christian Bale is repetitiously a very convincing character in this movie for him to pull off that he is still a non-emotional person. So, ultimately we have it to where in this movie we push on, because there's things going on in this film. We ultimately have it to where Christian Bale has to bust down this woman that seems to have some seemingly underground emotional room of sorts. He has to bust through this wall to ultimately find this entire room that has all this cool, interesting stuff in it. It has records, it has all kinds of things, and so ultimately we have it to where Christian Bale is going to try to play the music at some point, and while everyone is gone, while everyone leaves, he's going to come back to this to play some records or whatever. But reasonably, they were just going to burn the entire room, but ultimately Christian Bale is like, no, we got to dust this all for prints, because we got to see, like, it seems like this took a lot of work out of a bunch of people. It's not just her, so we got to dust this whole entire room to see if anybody else was a part of this. So we ultimately find Mary O'Brien arrested, and so reasonably we have it to where Christian Bale's character is talking to Mary and having interesting conversations, kind of like breaking down some things here and there. I think the most interesting part is when Christian Bale pushes Mary in front of a mirror and says, "Look at you!" And then ultimately he's looking at himself and he's like, "What?" Because ultimately they can't have mirrors here. Like they can't have much of anything that's like gives them vanity or whatever. Like to have a mirrored framed thing, I think the was the big thing that ultimately they couldn't have, like the mirror framed. Anyways, we ultimately have it to where ultimately Mary is going to burn, sadly enough. But it seems all while Christian Bale is having a connection with Mary, and ultimately to go back when no one's there, and play records and stuff like that. Kind of look at all the stuff that she has and kind of just get some connections with any number of these things. At some point, we also find out that there are vicious animals out there. Vicious animals that seem to be like all around in one area. And so ultimately, they are going to have to kill these vicious animals. These vicious animals called puppies. No! So we have it to where Christian Bale is ultimately picking up one of the dogs, and ultimately the dog licks him on the nose or something. And so ultimately Christian Bale is ultimately looking at this puppy, and he's like, you know what? Like, maybe I'll keep this dog because ultimately it seems like there is. I've heard um, that there is a pandemic of diseases that are coming around in this area, and it could tie into these pets. So I'm gonna get this pet tested, so that way we can be less concerned about a disease that is spreading around within these animals. Ultimately, you just have the dog go back into the trunk of his car for ultimately for him to be just taking care of it, just to leave it in the trunk for I don't know how long because there's nowhere else he can go with it. We ultimately have it to where it seems that there is a police force that is ultimately going to his car. Ultimately, he left his coat in the trunk that ultimately has his ID, and so ultimately we have the cops that stop him, and he's like, "Dude, I'm a police officer. Like, I am so and so person." And ultimately, they're like, "We don't know who you are. Like, where's your ID?" And he's like, it's in my coat. I don't have it." So recently, they hear a dog sound, and so ultimately, they're like, "Hey, can we search your car? We want to go in through your trunk." And ultimately, Christian Bale's like, "No, like, dude, I'm a police officer. Like, do I have to tell you my badge number and whatever I need to tell you?" And then so ultimately, you have the detective that's just like, "Oh, well, actually, I do recognize you." And so, but ultimately, you have it to where they hear a dog sound, and so ultimately, they want to open the trunk, and so ultimately, they do. And so reasonably, they find a dog in there, and so ultimately, Christian Bale kills all of these men over a puppy. He kills them all. He's like, "Well, you found out my puppy, so I'm just gonna have to kill all of you." And so he does. He just flips the guns around yet again and just kills all of them. And an awesome and amazing scene over a puppy. It's John Wick before John Wick. And so, with the exclusion of in John Wick, ultimately the puppy dies in the end. That's just how that movie goes. Um, in this movie, Puppy doesn't die. So, justifiably, pushing on. So, we ultimately have it to where Christian Bale is feeling things, and ultimately we find out that Mary O'Brien ultimately was in a relationship with Sean Bean's character, Christian Bale's partner. And so ultimately, with that time between those people, like Christian Bale is like, "Oh my god, well I really like Mary now, because like she was friends with my partner." Ultimately, when Christian Bale is ultimately looking at his partner's dead body, he is ultimately telling him, "Man, I'm actually really sorry. Like I really am sorry for your death, for your because it was pointless." So we ultimately just kind of see Christian Bale kind of arguing with his superior, arguing about uh, how anybody who is kind of feeling should get the ability to be able to kind of rehabilitate and be able to have a chance to become unemotional again, and that maybe that their judgments are too strict and blah blah blah. But ultimately, we have Christian Bale's superior that's just like, "No, like just wipe them all out before they keep spreading." So Christian Bale wants to definitely, Christian Bale wants to definitely try to extinguish all of these emotional people, and so Christian Bale is telling his superior that he wants to go to the Mecca, or the highest nest of emotional people, to otherwise t- find them and kill them all. And so reasonably we have Christian Bale, who seemingly is sleeking into like nests of emotional people, and ultimately he's helping them. Ultimately, he is shooting down the police officers, and ultimately he is letting the emotional people escape. To ultimately, he is led to the ringleader of emotional people, I guess, William Fichtner, who ultimately is Jurgen, who is kind of the highest rung of people, and ultimately he used to be a clergy or a he used to be who Christian Bale was, and ultimately he had changed too. You ultimately see him in the early movie being one of Christian Bale's characters, but ultimately he had changed. So we find out that similarly Christian Bale is going to try to find out the underground place of this environment and help them out. Try to help them figure out how to take down his superiors, his bosses, and so on and so forth. And so, reasonably, all while that's going on, we ultimately find out that Christian Bale's son is actually has not been taking his medication as well. That ultimately he's been taking it. He hasn't been taking it since they took mom, or since they took his mother, and so ultimately, Christian Bale's son is just like, well, hey, if you're not taking your medication, I didn't take mine, so like whatever. If you're going down, I'm going down. So pushing on. So we ultimately have it to where Christian Bale needs to find his superior, the guy who is ultimately known as Father, that seems to just be doing all these political-esh like things to tell people what's going on or what we should all be doing, or he's kind of repetitiously giving speeches telling everybody that we should all have sameness, and we should all have uniformity. And ultimately, there's one point where every single detective's desk all looks the same, to where Christian Bale is adjusting his entire desk to look different than everyone else's. And ultimately, Tay Diggs comes in. He's like, "Why are you moving your desk around? Like, did you not like your desk?" And he's like, "Oh no, I'm just optimizing it for." I'm just optimizing it. I think I can really see how I can improve my work by having all these things moved in a certain way. So I thought that was really interesting how you looked at everyone's desk and they're all the same and they're wearing the same clothes and everything like that. So we have it at some point where ultimately we have it to where Christian Bale is giving up his gun at some point to Tay Diggs' character, and we have it to where after we find that Christian Bale is going to make his way to find Father to try and kill him, ultimately thinking that if you kill Father, then everything else would just be undone. So, but the only problem is that Christian Bale's character has to go see Mary O'Brien burn alive. And so ultimately, we have Jurgen who is telling John, don't go. Don't go. They're gonna find. They're gonna see you get emotional. They're gonna see you, so don't go. But John's like, well, Mary doesn't have anybody. I have to go. So John goes, and ultimately we see her, Mary O'Brien, burning up, and we see Christian Bale cry, And then ultimately we see him fall to the ground, and ultimately he's just a mess. Ultimately we have Tay Diggs, who is turning Christian Bale in, and ultimately he is put into his office, and ultimately to talk to DuPont. So here's the interesting thing. We have it all turned around where Brandt ultimately is talking to DuPont, ultimately saying, yeah, I found your ringleader. I found your key human. I found your emotional human. I found your a guy that has otherwise been talking to all the big heads of the emotional people and so on and so forth. Ha ha ha! I got him. I got him. I told you. I told you, cleric, that I would make my career out of you. Ha ha ha! And so Christian Bale's like, yeah, you're right. And so reasonably they end up finding some evidence that alludes to Tay Diggs' character actually being the emotional cleric. Because we have it to where Christian Bale says, yeah, the fingerprints or the bullets and or the gun that was found in in uh in the ringleader of this whole thing was actually Tay Diggs' gun. And so Brant is just like, wait a minute, I'm not feeling anything. I'm not emotional. I'm not no. So we have to where the smoking gun is all over Tay Diggs, and so recently he's getting booked on being on the wrong charge of being quite possibly the culprit of this whole thing, and not Christian Bale's character. And Christian Bale moves on to seeing Father, to finally get a the ability to be able to talk to this person, because we have it to where Christian Bale turns in all of his cronies, and so Christian Bale just immediately thinks that he is going to be able to see Father because he's brought in the biggest case that he's ever done. So Christian Bale sees Father, and what we find out is Father isn't actually a real thing. It's just some voice that ultimately says speeches. Ultimately, the real, true ringleader of this whole thing is DuPont. So, we ultimately have it to where Christian Bale ultimately was supposed to do some test, and ultimately the test was to uh, solve some riddle. Riddle which Christian Bale could not answer. And so Tay Diggs walks up behind him and answers the riddle for him, ultimately saying again, it's like, ha ha ha, like, I knew I was going to make my career off of you. So we ultimately have to have Christian Bale with sword in hand, slicing through a bunch of people and making his way through all of these people to kill them all off, ultimately to then just be done with all of this, just to reasonably just be able to move forward and have people do whatever they want instead of being controlled by Father, because ultimately we have Christian Bale running around shooting every single TV screen, every single thing that ultimately is otherwise tied to Father's speeches or speaking. And so we just have Christian Bale just ultimately just saying, like, I'm done with all this. Like, we should be our own people, and ultimately we should do whatever we want, and I'm tired of killing people for meaningless reasons. So yeah, that's just kind of how the movie concludes, with just basically everybody's like, F it, yeah, I'm done with all this. So, speaking of being done, I'm being done with equilibrium, so let's go out of our way to go into Passengers. So, ultimately, I'm going to pause here so ultimately I can get set to ultimately get into the character names, the actors' names, and pastors. So let's pause here for a second. The casting is really going to be very easy and very short, but ultimately I'll just do that anyway so we can make sure if there's a name or whatever that comes up, because ultimately I probably won't know names of this movie. So let's pause here. Passengers. Ultimately, this movie actually was surprisingly, like, I thought it was actually a pretty good film. I thought the story, I was like, oh my god, like how clunky is this story going to be? How like boring is it going to be? Uh because like once I kind of figured out immediately what the concept was, where it's just like, oh okay, so it's somebody in a spaceship for a long period of time, and so now there's a repetitive montaging going on showcasing seemingly a year and or years of time, because ultimately you have repetitiously a concept of we have a ship that ultimately is to malfunction. Ultimately, we have it seemingly where a ship is malfunctioning and all of a sudden unlocks a person who is cryogenically sleeping, which ultimately is Chris Pratt's character. So we have it seemingly where Chris Pratt is ultimately stuck uh, to ultimately be awake for a very longevous amount of time, to the point of him basically being dead. Because reasonably, he is, of course, of a certain age right now, currently, and basically, by the time that he is able to get to the planet that he is supposed to get to, that is going to, of course, take seemingly 80 some odd years or 90 some odd years. So ultimately, this guy is going to die well before he will even get to this planet. So reasonably, he is desperately trying to call anybody. He is desperately trying to go through any like settings and anything under the ship to ultimately say, "Hey, yeah, my cryogenic stasis, yeah, that thing broke and I woke up. Uh, help? Anybody? Can anybody help me?" Basically, to the point where every single answer has absolutely nothing that can help him. Basically, he is trying to break into any seemingly part of the ship that will get him answers, and ultimately that seems impossible. We have to our Christian Bale. Chris Pratt ultimately seems to be a repairman, but ultimately there is only so much he can do. So while this is going on, you ultimately have a ship that is seemingly going to malfunction. And so, recently, I think if a lot of people, it's like, oh, well, like, why is there Jennifer Lawrence in this movie? Why is there, like, is like at first a lot of people would just think, oh, is this just a movie where Chris Pratt is just in this movie, and at the very tail end of it, it's just gonna be like Jennifer Lawrence eventually coming in and whatever. No, like it's not gonna be like 100% like I Am Legends, but it does feel like that. And eventually we actually will get more people than just Jennifer Lawrence and Chris Pratt eventually. But I'll get into that. So, I really enjoy this movie. I thought reasonably there was some. I think it was kind of weird that there seemed to not really be much of anything reasonably going on within the ship. But I thought that there was some interesting moments going on in this movie as well. You ultimately have Jennifer Lawrence character who is swimming, and ultimately I'm like, okay, well, what ends up happening later, I was like, wow, that is like an amazing visual to try to pull off in this movie. Uh, I ultimately thought that the second half of the movie was really unsettling. When ultimately there were even more and more problems going on with the ship, and like everything was going horribly awry to the point of them just like having a really tough time doing any number of things. So I was just like, oh my god, this is awful. Like, man, why is it that like there's no physical person actually manning this ship, seemingly while it's going off? Like you would have thought that there would have been some artificial life form that would have noticed a problem going on with the ship, and so ultimately they would have had to have forcibly had to wake somebody up, or ultimately would have came up with an artificial life form that could fix things while people are asleep. Like, you're not really giving much of a safety net for anybody. It's just like, well, hey, if the ship just f's up, it just f's up. It sucks to be you. That's kind of a weird notion about this ship, but that's just how it just goes. I guess that they, when creating this ship, that they didn't really factor into a lot of things. Ultimately, this movie at some points quasi reminds me of the movie Event Horizon, and I will explain why in spoilers. Because of course we actually have a person that reminds me of that movie in here, but still, this ship kind of reminds me of Event Horizon a lot. But anyways, so going on into this movie, I thought the more we got into it, I was like, okay, well, there's a lot of montaging. There's a ton of montaging going on to this movie, and you kind of forcibly have to do that because it's showing the progression of, like, it's showing the Matt Damon approach of this movie. And as if you've ever seen the movie Martian, where ultimately Matt Damon is stuck on Mars, like you can't just shoot it as like every single day. There's just got to be a montaging of eventually a buildup of him being on Mars for so long, where it's like in here you have to do the same thing because it's the only way you can shoot this movie. So going on into here, like I really thought Chris Pratt being in this movie was really enjoyable. I thought the approach for Jennifer Lawrence's character was enjoyable. Uh, I thought the way that they tried to do this was. I thought a lot of it was just kind of like, okay, like, I. Uh, I probably don't really like much of Chris Pratt's movies. I probably don't like much of Jennifer Lawrence movies, but when looking at it, like this amalgamation of stuff going on, I think the writing really benefited whether who was cast to this movie at all. So really, it was good writing. It didn't matter who exactly these people who were cast in this movie. Could have been anybody. It still would have been a good film to me. So let's ultimately break down and ultimately talk about this in spoiler terms, because ultimately you're going to learn there is not a huge amount of stuff going on in this movie that I have to go heavy out of my way to say a bunch of stuff. Because reasonably, it's probably going to be a very simplistic review, I hope. So let's go into spoiler time. It's spoiler time. It's about the time to spoil this movie. So reasonably, like I said, we have it to where Chris Pratt, who ultimately plays Jim, ultimately had gotten awakened early. And so reasonably, you have a ship that is kind of completely spinning upon its own, because ultimately we find out that this ship had gotten hit with a meteor and ultimately is starting to malfunction. Supposedly we're told that it should have been impossible for this ship to get hit with a meteor, but it did anyways. So we find out that Chris ultimately gets awakened from his sleeping journey 80 years too early, or 80 to 90 years too early. And so ultimately he's like, what? Like, dude, I'm gonna die. What? I'm gonna die alone. Like, I'm going to die, and like this is gonna suck because reasonably by the time that everyone else awakes on this ship, I'm gonna be dead. I'm gonna be freaking dead, and this sucks. So reasonably, we have within this film uh, that I have to pause here for a second. All right. So we have Chris Pratt, who is ultimately stuck, ultimately desperately trying to call anybody he can. Ultimately, that phone call is going to cost him seemingly $12,000 and all kinds of absurdity. Because reasonably, he's trying to connect to Earth to ultimately try and get anybody to help him, but seemingly that phone call will take seemingly as long as it will for him to live. So ultimately, he just feels like it's a moot point to uh, that ultimately that phone call will be meaningless. By he'll be dead by the time that a phone call actually gets there. So ultimately, the plan for this planet is to find another planet that is Earth-like, that ultimately people could live. And so ultimately, this is going to take them a very long time to get there. And so reasonably, we find out that seemingly Chris Pratt's character is a handyman, a fix-it of sorts. And so eventually, we just find him just going like, "Well, there's nothing I can do but die." So reason, I guess they just have to make the most out of this ship visit, or this ship, and so ultimately, you have it to where Chris Pratt ultimately starts latching on to Michael Sheen's character, or Michael Sheen, who's Arthur, that is a artificial life form of sorts or a robot of sorts that ultimately is a bartender. And so reasonably we have Chris Pratt, who's ultimately Jim, ultimately talking to a robot because he has no one else to talk to. We ultimately find Chris Pratt's character repetitiously just growing hair over a long period of time. Ultimately, it seems that Chris Pratt's character is losing his mind. It seems like while Chris Pratt is trying to just kind of live his life on the ship, we find out things are slowly but surely malfunctioning every once in a while. So we ultimately find that Chris Pratt has nothing but time, so ultimately he just kind of researches everybody that is on the ship. It seems that he tries to figure out every single way of trying to go back to sleep, and nothing seems to work. Everything that he tries to look up is just not exactly what he needs, or ultimately, every time that he tries to get to any of the crew members that could probably help him, it seems like there is a door that ultimately cannot be opened to wake anybody up. So, pushing on to Chris Pratt is starting to research people, and ultimately he lends upon himself seeing this girl named Aurora that ultimately is being played by Jennifer Lawrence. So, we have it to where Jim ultimately is listening to the interviews of Aurora, and he's like, "Wow, it seems like me and her are kind of like one of the same. It seems like her interviews are really interesting, and like it seems like we're kind of very similar in this and that." And so ultimately, we have Chris Pratt, who character who is starting to clean himself up, starting to realize like, hey, how about I just kind of shave my beard? And the entire time, he is talking about Aurora. He's going like, oh my god, like I like Aurora. like, yeah, I really like this girl Aurora, like Aurora, to the point where he's like, I'm gonna stop mentioning her name, I'm gonna stop bringing her up, and Arthur's character is like, yeah, sure, like you keep bringing her up anyways. So we have it to where Chris Pratt's character is desperately coming up with a conundrum of not wanting to open up uh, the sleep tank of Aurora, because ultimately he is desperate into not dying alone, but to just die with someone. So reasonably, we have it to where, and I love the I love the analysis that we get from another character in this movie of who Chris Pratt was, and like I love the analyzing of how another character breaks this down. So we ultimately have Chris Pratt who opens up uh, Jennifer Lawrence's sleeping bay or sleep tank, and ultimately she goes through the exact same like procedures and everything like that um, that Chris has already gone through. She starts running through the entire like space station trying to figure out what she can find out about her her sleeping tank being open, and ultimately everything like that. And she's ultimately asking Jim's character everything about like, well, like, have you been able to figure out how to like turn the sleeping bay things back on, and like so we can go back to sleep? And he's like, no, I've just been here for a year, and every single thing that I found is not something that I could repair. I've already been awake for a year trying to figure out this all out, and everything that's telling me is not working. She's ultimately asking if there's any crewmen that are awake, and ultimately telling her no, they're in their own separate rooms, and that room can't be opened. Because ultimately, Jennifer Lawrence's character Aurora is thinking that like she's awake and she had arrived by Homestead, and it's like, no, we're not even close. We're about 90 years away from reaching Homestead 2. So she's like, oh my god, like, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I guess luckily Aurora is lucky enough that she doesn't have a boyfriend, or Jim has a girlfriend, because ultimately that went with them on this ship. Because I guess luckily they're both single and they're going on their way to be, I guess, just realizing that it's like, well, they're kind of stuck in this place together. So we have it to where ultimately both of them are just more so just starting to realize they're both going to die together. And so reasonably we have it to where, well, they have nothing better to do. Aurora just starts making her own book, and because she has nothing better to do. So she's making a book about her life, and plus also making a book about her being in this environment. Ultimately, it seems that while Aurora is away, Pratt and Arthur are talking, and Arthur is like, "Well, you're gonna tell her, right, that you opened up her sleeping bay. Like, you're gonna tell her, right?" And Jim is like, well, I think I'll bring it up eventually." And Arthur's like, oh, okay, sure. So, knowing full well that he will never tell her, because it's like, hey, like, she's going to take it horribly. So, we ultimately have it to where Jennifer Lawrence's character is ultimately seemingly doing some of the same stuff that Jim had done, because Jim kind of is talking her through all of it. It seems that Aurora is swimming a lot. That seems to be what the thing that she does is. Uh, that's her solo thing, and we ultimately have it to where it seems that these two are spending a lot of time together because ultimately that's all they can do. So ultimately they're not separating themselves. It seems like, if anything, they are getting closer together, just kind of spending all kinds of time together because that's all they can do. And really, they're just kind of just doing everything that the ship has to offer. And there's a whole montage of that with them being together for a year. It seems that eventually we get to the point to where Jim is going to give her a ring, because ultimately they've been together for a year, but also Jim eventually asks Aurora out for a date. So we have it to where Aurora is talking to Martin, because ultimately Jim is off doing something, getting his wedding ring. And Arthur ends up telling Aurora, it's like, well, like, I couldn't have thought a year from now that your relationship would have gone so well when Jim opened your sleeping bay and woke you up. And she's like, what? Like, he did what? Like, I wasn't supposed to be awoken, or I wasn't supposed to be awake, but he woke me? And Arthur's like, yeah, yeah. So the stupid robot tells Aurora that she was murdered by Jim's character in some turn of phrase. So we have to Aurora is now seeing Jim, and she is like beating the crap out of him and running all the way around this entire ship. And he's ultimately trying to speak to her through the loudspeaker, and ultimately saying, like, you know what, I'm sorry, like, if anything, if anything, like, I had been on the ship for so long, like, I was losing my mind. And like, if anything, like, I saw some interviews and stuff of you, and I liked you. And and you just get Jennifer Lawrence's character that's like, I don't care. I don't care about any of that. I don't care that you liked me. I don't care that you thought that we could be great together. I don't care. You murdered me. You killed me. And the only person that I'm going to be left here to rot with is just you and me, and the person who murdered me, and this and that. And so recently we have Chris Pratt who ultimately tries to make amends by putting a tree in the middle of this ship. Just, he digs a hole, and then ultimately he just freaking just plops a tree in seemingly in the middle of this ship somewhere. And ultimately, I guess Jennifer Lawrence is seeing this as some kind of amends to have been made, to ultimately try to say, hey, like, this isn't going to be the only living thing, or quasi-living thing that's going to be here with us. And so ultimately you can see this tree grow while we're going to be here forever, because sucks to be you, because I kept you, I woken you up. So we ultimately have it to where within this ship that we ultimately have on the loudspeaker somebody going, hey, who put a tree in the middle of my ship? We ultimately find out that Lawrence Fishburne is ultimately on this ship as well, and ultimately he's playing a character called Gus. So, and he's not a robot, he's not an artificial life form, he's a real captain of the ship, he's a capitan of the ship, or ultimately a member of this ship as a crew member. And so, ultimately we find out that Gus's sleep tank had severely malfunctioned, making Gus severely sick, to the point where he had like 600 things wrong with him, supposedly, via the sleep tank. And so ultimately, while Gus is just trying to make it through this ship, it seems like he's coughing blood and all kinds of things. I'm like, holy like, Lawrence Fishburne, no! Don't die, Lawrence Fishburne! No! You're supposed to make it through this, even though it doesn't make sense for you to make it through it, because ultimately you have 88 some odd years to still live, because this sleeping tank thing doesn't work out the way it's supposed to. But hey, at least Jim didn't open up your sleep tank like he did Jennifer Lawrence's character. So we have it to where Lawrence Fishburne is like, yeah, there's a lot of things going on and going wrong with this ship. This doesn't make sense for my sleep tank to malfunction the way it had, and also it doesn't make sense for any of the sleep tanks to malfunction the way they did. We have it to where at first they are trying to do diagnostics all around the ship, and ultimately we have it to where Jim ultimately finishes with his stuff before everyone else does. So we have Gus, who is checking on all the sleeping beds, and ultimately he is mentioning that, like, well, hey, yours, yeah, bizarrely did a weird, like, malfunction, but it wasn't as bad as my bed. But ultimately he went into Aurora's bed and was like, hey, there's nothing wrong with it. Seemed like somebody opened it. Was it you, Jim? Was it you? And Jim was like, well, yeah, like I've been awake for a year and change now, so I was really alone. And so Gus was like, okay, all right, there's nothing I can do. So it's like, dude, I'm awake too, so, and I'm gonna die soon. So we have it to where ultimately Jennifer Lawrence is going with Gus to have some alone time so she can talk to Gus and maybe look at him like Lawrence Fish only in the only way of which you can look at Lawrence Fishburne, that attractive man. Anyways, so we have Lawrence Fishburne who is talking to Jennifer Lawrence, and Aurora is like, do you know what he did to me? He woke me up. He murdered me. How could he? Throw him into space jail or something. What are you gonna do about it? And Gus's character breaks this down in the smartest way that I could have thought about it. It's like, this guy ultimately was to be awoken and forcibly, he was drowning. Like, he was drowning. So in looking at it, like, any drowning person would probably take someone else down with them because that's just their response. It's like, ultimately, they, like, if someone is going to die, they don't want to die alone. Sadly enough. We ultimately at some point had Chris Pratt ultimately going on a spacewalk with his spacesuit, ultimately just kind of like journeying out into space, and ultimately what he was going to do was he was ultimately going to open up the airlock without him having a spacesuit on. And I thought, like, man, that was like a very an emotional scene to ultimately see this guy so close to the trigger of just going like, well, like, I'm gonna die anyways. I might as well just speed it up a little bit so I can just suffocate and horribly die. Slowly and horrifically. And while Chris Pratt was so close to that button, I was like, don't do it. And ultimately he doesn't, and he just walks away. He's like, well, I guess I'm just gonna just die slowly but horrifically and whatever. I guess just what's gonna happen. I'm just gonna grow old and die and hopefully have nobody with me that ultimately I'm not gonna take down as I drown my way through here. So speaking of drowning, so we have it to where ultimately we find out that Lawrence Fishburne's character, the longer we go on to here, we find out that Lawrence Fishburne's character is really, really sick. That ultimately his space pod or his sleeping pod or whatever had made him really, really sick to the point where he has like 600 things wrong with him. And ultimately, he uh, is slowly but surely like passing out and all this kind of stuff. And so recently, uh, we end up having like Lawrence Fishburne ultimately, like he's gonna rest while everybody else is just gonna either rest or do their own thing. We ultimately have seemingly Jennifer Lawrence's character. She is just swimming. She's like, well, I guess I'm effed, so I guess we're just gonna have to swim because ultimately we can't quite figure out what exactly is going on with the ship. Uh, so we have it to where all of a sudden the gravity is shut off for this ship, and then all of a sudden, like the water is floating up in the air, and all of a sudden, like Chris Pratt is just kind of floating in his room, and then all of a sudden, like Lawrence Fishburne is kind of just he's just kind of floating almost quasi out of his bed, and where all of a sudden the ship all of a sudden realizes, hey, let's turn gravity back on because ultimately Jennifer Lawrence's character is drowning in this water that is in the air because she can't really get like she's swimming in the middle of the air to try to get out of this water so she can get a breath, ultimately to be hit by some other wave of water. I'm like, man, this scene is awesome looking, but insane. Because ultimately, I'm like, wouldn't that be your greatest fear? To just like, to me, like, it would freak me out if ultimately, like, gravity on the Earth was all of a sudden turned off and you were just floating off into whatever. I think that would be like my greatest fear of a world of no gravity, or just seemingly like when the scenes of which that they have like gravity is all of a sudden just turning off and on, like that freaked me out a little bit going on into this movie. So we ultimately have it to where Jennifer Lawrence's character is drowning in midair, and to where ultimately eventually when the gravity does come on, it seems that the thrust of Jennifer Lawrence being smacked back into ground ultimately, I guess, revives her somehow because ultimately she was drowning. So we ultimately have Chris Pratt also wake up to be smashed right into the ground. And so ultimately they're just like, well, hey, what's going on with the gravity? Hey, what's going on with the ship? There's a lot of crap going on. What the F is going on? Let's figure this out and figure it out now. So they're ultimately trying to come up with all of these things, and Lawrence Fishburne is eventually coming up with the consensus of just like, well, this is almost getting down to like a total system failure, and like this doesn't quite like make sense anymore. What the heck is going on? And so ultimately, while Lawrence Fishburne's character is ultimately trying to figure out what is going on, he is ultimately dying. Because reasonably, he is basically about to die. Like, he has hours to live. And so ultimately, he is telling, he's getting his Trust Blues on, and it's like, dude, I'm going to die. Hopefully, everything comes out well for you guys, because I'm going to die. So, we have it to where ultimately Lawrence Fishburne is giving them his idea of sorts, and ultimately telling them, hey, like, I'm gonna give you this, like, so that way you guys can make it through the ship, and ultimately you guys can do some things that you weren't able to do before, because ultimately they're going to need it. And then that's when just we have Lawrence Fishburne's character just pass away, sadly. So we push on to ultimately have it to where they have to figure out what is going on with this ship. They're trying as much as possible to do all kinds of ship diagnostics, and ultimately they are finding out that it seems that there is holes being put throughout this ship because they open some little rooms that ultimately they find out that there are air pockets coming in from those rooms. And so ultimately they have to seal these air pockets, and then they end up finding out going further on into this that it seems that there is a seemingly fire going on in one room that is ultimately making this ship very unstable. So we have it to where ultimately Chris Pratt is trying to fix this malfunctioned, like I would call it, computer chip of sorts, to ultimately get this seemingly fire pushed out of this room. But ultimately, it seems that the problem is that the door to release this fire is ultimately jammed on some end, and so ultimately Chris Pratt has to spaceship or spacesuit his way out to open that hatch. Ultimately, he's going to weld off some door to ultimately see if he could brace himself behind it to ultimately try and save himself from getting completely burned. So we have it to where Jennifer Lawrence is getting the like trying to like like this. It seems that the longer and longer they're waiting, it seems that Jennifer Lawrence is ultimately getting things shot out at her. She gets a thing popped in her freaking arm, and she pulls it out. Uh, it seems like glass is starting to shatter from this environment that is getting heated up. So we have it to where basically Chris Pratt has to be pretty much Chris Hemsworth in this moment, because we find out that seemingly this door has a stupid malfunction that ultimately you have it to where Chris Pratt is trying to open this door and keep it open for this fire to come through. The only problem is that this door doesn't have a good opening mechanism that keeps it open repetitiously. So Chris Pratt's character has to basically hold this door open to let this fire come through, and basically that's almost coming through him. It's almost like in the Wolverine movie where Wolverine ultimately you have the nuke that comes over Japan, and like Wolverine has to like shield the Japanese soldier by like basically shielding the Japanese soldier with Wolverine's body, because ultimately he has like this metal thing over his head that he's holding to protect this Japanese soldier from getting hit by this nuke, and or by and so ultimately we get Wolverine to be a crispy critter, and but ultimately he has that healing factor, so he's perfectly fine. Whereas uh, it's kind of also like the Thor having to make Stormbreaker. So ultimately, I don't remember. I don't think that was Endgame, but ultimately a mood point. Could have been the thing before that. It could have been Infinity War. Whichever movie that he makes Stormbreaker, you'll if you've seen any number of those Avengers movies, you'll know what I mean. So we have it to where ultimately Chris Pratt is going to have to shield himself and have this fire come through with this door in front of his face. And ultimately, this guy is holding this door open as long as he can, but eventually, this fire is just pushing him out. Towards almost pushing him out into space. To ultimately, Chris Pratt has lost his air tether, and ultimately, he is starting to lose air. So Jennifer Lawrence has to rush as quickly as humanly possible. Doesn't really seem quite exactly like she's really all that rushing, because when looking at it, like, dude, she could have gave him CPR any point in time, but whatever. So we have it to where Jennifer Lawrence hits the button and ultimately everybody is saved, because Chris Pratt is saying, hey, like, ultimately we gotta save, like, there's 5,000 some odd people that are on the ship, so we gotta save all of them. So if Chris Pratt dies, then ultimately he'll die for all those people. So, interestingly enough, Chris Pratt doesn't receive one single burn out of all of this, weirdly enough. But anyways, so Chris Pratt is now floating in space, ultimately just to freeze. He's almost to forcibly almost pull a Yondu. And so, if you probably had seen Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, you probably understand what I mean. But anyways, I'm talking about so many Avengers movies and so many Marvel films and whatever. Uh, for probably a review that probably no one has probably seen either, but that's completely okay. Anyways, so going on into this, we have Jennifer Lawrence fishing her way out to get Chris Pratt, which would seem like an impossible task, but she pulls it off. So we ultimately have her fishing him out and reeling him back in. This kind of ending to me almost kind of reminds me of the Val Kilmer Mars movie, where ultimately Val Kilmer has to uh, like get some ship to rocket off of Mars for for the girl who ultimately played Trinity from Matrix to like fish him out of his little spaceship to ultimately retrieve him. I really enjoy that Mars movie. I kind of enjoy a lot of space films, but ultimately to me this wasn't much of a space film. It was just kind of like, well, here's a spaceship and here's a movie of people being in a spaceship. So we have it to where Jennifer reels Chris in, and so ultimately she doesn't give him CPR. She just drags him all the way to the medical bed that ultimately Lawrence Fishburne was in before, and so ultimately she gives ultimately they do a diagnostic and they say, yeah, we think he's dead. So reasonably, I don't think we're gonna do anything unless like, hey, if we have any real real reason to. And so ultimately, we have it to where Jennifer Lawrence's character tries to override. She has to remember the code that ultimately Lawrence Fishburne gave quickly, and he's only used it once. So she has to remember the numbers, and so ultimately, we have it to where Chris Pratt is seemingly being revived, and otherwise we were just assumed that well, F it, he's just gonna die, and Jennifer is gonna be here by herself, and sucks to be her. Boo hoo! This is how it's going to end. But oh no, we just have it to where Chris Pratt has to just go, I'm alive, and so we're like, oh, of course. We can't have the inconvenient ending where it's just gonna like, oh no, so Chris Pratt saved all these people, but in the end he's still alive. Because he has to be a hero that has to be alive at the end. F him for being alive at the end of this movie. So we ultimately find that Chris Pratt is doing some diagnostics on this medical bed, and he finds out that there is some way for this medical bed to turn into this sleeping like bay thing. Ultimately, to knock out seemingly Jennifer's character for the time of which that she could be awake to be back into Homestead too. And so Chris is giving her that ultimatum. It's like, well, hey, like I almost did kill you, so if anything, I'm going to give you the option now to be able to go back to sleep. And so, but Jennifer's like, well, yeah, but you would still be alive. You would still have to, like, live and die with no one. And Chris is like, well, I've been here alone by myself before. Like, we fixed whatever the problem was with the ship. Everything seems to be copacetic. Nothing else is probably going to go horribly awry, I hope. So, yeah, because this is a crappy ship, and we should have just awoken everybody just to make sure that freaking this ship just stays afloat. Because heaven forbid. Um, but so, anyways, because evidently through all of these travels, evidently they were not going to rack into any like alien life, which ultimately they have to bizarrely defend themselves. Ultimately, again, Event Horizon. Yeah, Lawrence Fishburne was in the movie Event Horizon. That movie is a little bit more horrific than this movie was, but it's kind of very similar to this movie. So maybe hence why Lawrence Fishburne was kind of easily wanting to be within this movie because it felt just like Event Horizon, but with a lesser horrific or horror element to it than this movie, with the exception of there being a disaster movie afoot in here. So, anyways, we have it to where Jennifer Lawrence has this ultimatum, ultimatum, and we have it to where Chris is ultimately looking at a wedding ring at the bar, and he's like, "Well, yeah, I guess Jennifer's just gonna sleep. Good for her. Huzzah, huzzah." And so instead, we find out that Jennifer Lawrence's character is going to the bar with a nice dress to ultimately say, "Oh no, I'm just going to live the rest of my life with you." And yeah, you better give me that ring. You better Beyonce put a ring on it because reasonably, we're just going to be living the rest of our lives here together and die. And so we ultimately have it to where the 88 years later, we have the crew that all wake up to a bizarrish forest-ish like ship, to where we find out that these people have made a longevous life together, uh, and so reasonably, I guess after these people died, it's like, hey, this is just the aftermath of whatever the ship looked like. Because sucks to be you, because you guys were asleep for all this. But hey, I'm gonna give you this little note to let you guys know what all freaking happened to your ship while you were sleeping. So that's how the movie just kind of tapers off. It kind of like the last thing you see is kind of Lawrence or Jennifer Lawrence and Chris Pratt like swimming together, and they kiss, and then ultimately that's kind of how like their life supposedly ends. And then Q 88 years later, ultimately the ship crew is all like, "Hey, yeah, what's going on with my ship? What the f? What did people do? Like, what the f is this jazz?" And so ultimately they're just like, well, F it. We're going to get out of this ship anyways because we're ultimately just going to go into the homestead too and just be fine with all this garbage that they did. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to go out of my way to say. Because ultimately it was kind of interesting to see, like, Chris Pratt. Like, ultimately he, like, the step kept malfunctioning, especially when that gravity thing broke. It was like, wow, that's crappy. Funny enough, we had it to where ultimately Chris Pratt like could only drink coffee. It seems at one point they were trying to get the food stuff to work, but ultimately that eventually malfunctions. Uh, so reasonably, like the elevator even was malfunctioning while Chris Pratt was trying to use the elevator, and I was like, man, that's kind of scary. So like yeah, there was a lot of interesting like malfunctions going on, interesting story, and it was a kind of funny movie to kind of have like two common people that ultimately were trying to make it to the new world that ultimately left everything behind because they had nothing really left to leave, and they just kind of embarked on having to forcibly fix the ship, which they didn't really have much of real true legitimate equivalence to try and fix, but they did it anyways because ultimately the crew was ultimately just incapacitated because they were asleep. So yeah, we ultimately have Lawrence Fishburne's character that ultimately had the qualifications to ultimately wake all the other crew members up, but recently they didn't. But Lawrence Fishburne was able to like try to help them figure out in the time that he was alive for to fix this ship. But yeah, so anyways, yeah, I'm going to get out of here. It was an interesting movie. I really enjoyed it, but I'm going to enjoy getting my way out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.